morning, good night, whatever of where are you connecting us today. So thank you so much for coming to this interesting conversation that we're going to have with Can Argatan regarding his book about Gezi Park. So as you know, in RC48, we had been organizing this seminar series to showcase the research or the different kind of work that members had been doing in different years. So it's a pleasure for me to have one of my esteemed colleagues, Can Argatan. And Can, welcome. I don't know if you want to present yourself or anything that you want to say before starting.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Camilo. Thank you so much for inviting me to the Global Conversations. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Criminology in Framingham State University in Massachusetts, United States. And the book we're going to be talking about is my first monograph titled Gezi, The Making of a New Political Community in Turkey. And I'm looking forward to the conversation and the questions maybe after the talk.
So thank you so much, Can. So the methodology is going to be really simple. I'm going to do some questions with Kant, let's say for 40 minutes. And after that, if you have any questions, please just, of course, the floor will be yours to do some conversation with Kant regarding his book. Please I receive my apologies in advance that I'm feeling a little bit flu. So sorry if I'm sound like a frog, but hopefully you will see. So, Can, I want you to start opening questions regarding the context of your book, and I would like to know if you can give us an overview of your book, if you can give us what was the main motivation that you had to explore the Gezi protest, and what do you think could be the impact on the political community, and their impact on political community formation in Turkey. So, what could you think could be the impact of your book in Turkey?
Yes, definitely. And as we agreed, Camilo, you are going to stop me if I started talking too much before you ask your second question or the others, all right? So it has been almost 12 years now that Gezi Park protests happened in 2013, and the book is about the protests, but a little more too. It started as to understand why these protests, and you may remember that 2010s have been almost was the decade of social protests all over the world, starting maybe with Occupy, and then the Arab Spring, and different parts of Europe and almost everywhere else too. So Gezi Park protests were one of those instances of uprisings in that global age, in that time. And my interest just was that, I was exhilarated to see that something like this that has been so global and all over the world has been happening in Turkey as well. So the book set out to understand what was happening there. But of course, it didn't stop there, and we'll talk about it later maybe, that the Gezi Park protests were not just protests that appeared and that just disappeared. The book turned out to be one that is telling the story of those activists and the ideas and the whole movement that not just only started at that particular time, but also continued for at least a couple of years. That's the attempt. That was my attempt to understand how the whole thing kind of evolved. And 2000s, of course, 1990s too, were also the times of neoliberal urbanization. That is, the different stage of global capitalism, if you like, when the urban cities, the urban places, became places of accumulation and capital accumulation, which of course triggered most of these social protests that we were talking about in 2010. So that the book, the main motivation of the book was that to understand what was happening. And what was happening was not just why did we see these protests, but also what happened to these people, how they began to imagine themselves as activists and later as citizens, and how they envisioned to change the world, but also create a new world too, in addition to resisting something that all began with Gezi. So the book is about that. The book is about that. And I can't. Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry. It's because listening to you, I always found really interesting what are the personal and scholarly motivations to do this kind of book, right? Beyond the approach that you are saying. I don't know if you can just share with us a little bit about what is the personally and academically and a motivation for you to research about this subject and how this fits with your broader research agenda. So I'm just curious about that. Ken.
Yeah. I am originally from Turkey, but I have been living in the United States for more than 20 years right now. So I have always been a student of, and I'm always interested in Turkish politics, but also, especially social change in the United States, more contemporary social change in Turkey. I mean, so that's always been something like that. But I have never been a student of social movements until Gezi happened. I think Gezi protests have been something that changed the trajectory, a scholarly trajectory of so many scholars that are from or that are students of Turkey and Turkish politics. So that my interest evolved, as I said, it was exhilarating to see something like this happening in Turkey. So that's where my focus ended up being in the past 10 to 12 years. That's the personal story, if you like. And I was in Turkey during the main protest. I was able to be not a active part like an activist, but a active observant of the initial protests, then the first occupation of that park that we are talking about. For those friends maybe who are on the call who may not be familiar with the whole thing, 2013 protest in Turkey was an attempt, an act of defense of a small park in the heart of Istanbul, in Taksim Square, where the government decided to demolish a public park, which has been there forever, and try to build a mall for consumption. And people, especially beginning with environmentalist activists, were trying to draw attention to these plans without necessarily being too successful in garnering support from other sectors of the society. So Gezi Park protests exploded as an attempt to defend the demolition of this park. And then, of course, there were clashes on the streets for a couple of days. Then the activists actually occupied the park for 2 weeks in defense of the park. And I was lucky to be there a couple of times during the actual occupation, observing all these people acting the ways that they acted, the interactions, the conversations, the euphoria, and all these feelings and emotions that appeared there. Were really attractive. Were really something that needed to be explained, needed to be understood. So that's my personal trajectory, if you like, how it kind of
Okay.
corresponded with what happened there.
So I want to move now a little bit regarding the conceptual framework that you're using in your book. And when I have the opportunity to read your book, you develop a concept that I found really interesting, and it's the concept of new political community. And when Khan was analyzing the Gezi Park episode, as you call it, I found that concept really interesting. So I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit more about what is exactly the meaning of this concept of new political community that you had been elaborated in your book, and how this concept can engage with different theoretical frameworks or traditions that maybe have influenced your research and your scholarship.
Yeah, definitely. Political community is interesting because it kind of dates back, almost back to the Greeks. The idea of community, but also as a political community, to exist as a political thing, is something that has been in the minds of philosophers, political scientists, and also more recently, but more recently, I'm talking about maybe last 30, 40 years, the term was more, I think, used by international relations scholars to define a state, a government, a nation state, and its people, the people that, kind of the sovereign, that are sovereign. Political community had that kind of a political flavor. And community itself, just the word community, has a more like a, if you like, conservative kind of way of explaining how people, want to be together, how people are connected to each other, what kind of values emerge, exist to keep a group of people as a community. Those two approaches were not necessarily the ones that I wanted to use. So I felt that I needed to tweak the idea of what it means to be a people, what it means to be a community, what it means to be together. That was the idea. So I played with the idea of political community as I observed the emergence in the park, but later too, in neighborhoods, in squat houses, in different buildings or different, gatherings. The people were, those activists that I were observing, were trying to define themselves, identify as a new people, a different kind of people, a different kind of political community. That is a group of people in action, in active, kind of making something, begin to develop different values, different norms, uh, that gives them a feeling of us. Who are we? And what we are going to do, what we want, what we can achieve. Those questions were guiding these group of people, not necessarily, but also starting with defending a park, but then moving on. What do we want? How are we going to be together? What is the social contract, if you like, that we want to build for ourselves? And they do not necessarily rely on previous set of values that we ethnic background or national background. Those were given to us maybe for decades, if not centuries, that are calcified in our psyche. No, they were kind of building a different kind of set of values, if you like, through action, through activism. How are we going to defend the park first? Then how are we going to clean the park? And where are we going when they disperse us from the park? So what is the next movie that we are going to show to the neighborhood so that they kind of want to change things? So those practical questions and the answers to those questions began to create a set of values, set of, if you like, shared identity that I defined as political community. So political community, as this reworked definition, became my gauge, became my tool to understand how social movements, but especially the Gezi Park movement, began to, create this new identity and as an attempt to build a new world.
Because Can, after reading some of the chapters of your book, especially chapter 3 and chapter 4, I found that diversity is like a really important element during the Gezi demonstrations, and of course, like how the movement brought together, different people, different kind of, I don't know, scholars and activists for different kind of backgrounds and social identities. So I would like to know, how do you think this diversity shape or not the movement? What was the role of this diversity in shaping the movement in Gezi Park? And what do you think is the challenges that can pose this diversity in the creation of this political community that you are referring to?
I think that's a great question, Camilo, and thank you. People are still remembering. The Gezi Park protesters, the activists, they later who got into forums and assemblies in different neighborhoods, who squatted houses in different parts of Istanbul, still remember very fondly. Actually, it became like a legacy, if not a legend, that they could bring together so many different people from so many different walks of life, so many different identities. Especially definitely the main dynamo, if you like, of the movement were women, LGBTQI individuals, but also workers, white-collar employees, veterans, and all different sorts of people ended up first in the park to defend the park against demolition, but also the residents of different neighborhoods, of all ages, if you like, trying to do something. So different identities, different even political orientations at the beginning, very important. That's when we kind of started to hear about the term multitude, for instance, isn't it? By Hart and Negri, or 99% in Occupy against those. So there was this kind of bringing together of different identities that created the multitude. I think it can be traced in the Gezi Park case, in the way that, of course, a kind of a resentment, kind of an anger, brought together these people first, anger against the government's attempt to demolish this park. But then once in motion, it became something, a need, if you like, to sustain the movement going. So those identities began to interact with each other, began to shape each other, began to define each other. As we were talking about earlier, the political community thing. As they are turning into a people, they were recreating, if you like, reconstituting an identity. And if I may, at this point, if I could open up a little bit, and maybe that can help to trace what's happening in the book too. I realized, as I was thinking and researching more, there were three parallel dimensions, if you like, or three conditions, or three modes that were operating simultaneously that brought together the identities, helped reconstitute a new identity, maybe, or expand the identity to be more inclusive, but also the internal contradictions, because that's the latter part of your question, Camilo, isn't it? What kind of challenges it brings? So those three dimensions or three dynamics, if you like, that I could observe, included first what I call the mobilizational dimension. That is, you see people always active. They are always in the street. They are always in the park. For either one way or other, people are not just inactive political constituents, if you like, who would go to the ballot box every 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever. But people are actually doing politics by themselves in the street or in the park, in the assembly, in the squad house. That gave some sort of mobilization. That gave some sort of a dynamic to the whole thing. So that kind of helped to understand your identity, bring something in, but also create a new dimension in your identity. So mobilization was huge. It changed the person, the activist. It was more enlightening. So people were becoming aware of what's happening to their street, to their park, to their life. It was euphoric. People were really happy to be out there rather than being passive receivers of the news, and then they were, kind of resenting to it. They were actually figuring out that they were doing something. It was empowering. You could take things in your hand. Once you have the knowledge, for instance, how things work in the local assembly, you would realize that there are ways to, kind of take care of the things. And that mobilizational dimension was important in that new identity that would lead to the political community later. The second dimension was space, the spatial dimension, urban space, the city. But city is a fragmented place, isn't it? So it has, parks, it has streets, it has houses, it has buildings. So different sites in the city enabled different types of politics. You could march on the streets, meet in the park, do something in the house or in the building. So all these were like, if you like, a repertoire, a palette of different political tools that they gave to people, and people assumed identities. So you became, for instance, the person who carries news between different forums, or you became the defender of the barricade. You became a cook in the park when it is occupied. So different identities were shaped and merged that would lead to the political. And lastly, I know I've taken too much time for this question. The radical aspect, the third dimension that I have in mind, being radical and experiencing or enacting radical actions. It's again beyond the ballot box. It's beyond representative politics. It is actually thinking about and implementing, enacting radical action, which means, gathering together, discussing things, deciding about things. It doesn't have to be violent, not get me wrong, but it is something that they were prefiguring that didn't exist before in their decision-making and action. So these three dimensions, I close with this, these three dimensions constantly and simultaneously interacting when the whole Gezi episode was happening, from the protests to later forums and squat houses and what. Which shaped identities and created new ones. Yes, I stopped.
No, just trying to move forward regarding what you're saying about the construction of identities, and of course, all these elements of collective action. And one of the things that really led me thinking in different ways about the Gezi Park is the role of emotions and the construction of collective identity, because you are saying that protesters and demonstrators start to, address different kind of emotions to do the collective action, like anger, solidarity, and of course all these emotions of hope. So I would like to know if you can tell us a little bit about how you understand this link between the role of emotions and the formation of this new political community in the Gezi movement.
Yes, thank you. Yes, emotions are really important, aren't they? We are living in the age of emotions, if you like, especially anger, resentment, the rise of fascism and authoritarianism in almost all corners of the world right now, including in the United States where I am. So yes, emotions, of course, are very, very important, and they were important in the Gezi Park protests and their aftermath too. They were a set of emotions. I think it started, you can say, with anger and resentment back then too. But something like triggered it, the conversion of a park into a in a private mall, or it can be the rising of the ticket prices for buses, or it can be anti-authoritarian feelings, anti-austerity, kind of movements or feelings. Yeah, these emotions usually trigger. Uh, but in the contemporary global movements, I think what is important, and this is why I try to expand the if you like the temporal analysis, without necessarily focusing on the protests and how they rise and die, but how they try to sustain in different modes. So you can be clashing with the police in the streets, anger and resentment may be brought to you there. Then you may occupy, and which usually is the case with the protest in 2010s, that you occupy a space, a square, and later a park, a neighborhood, more sedentary, residential gatherings may happen. So the initial anger and resentment or those kind of emotions turn into something like hope, something like the euphoria of creating some experimenting and creating something new. But I'm always hesitant a little bit about emotions, and we can do it later in the question and answer session too, if people would like to talk more about it. Emotions are not free floating agents that kind of determine or have a direct impact on the action. Emotions usually, I always want to think about it the other way around. It's the material conditions, the acts and enactments, the activism itself that generate and shape, if you like, the emotions themselves too. For instance, as I said, the hope and doing something new, euphoria, trying to, become a part of a world, trying to live and experience a world that doesn't exist yet, prefiguring a world, uh, are the emotions that emerge from the practical and material actions, if you like, that activists usually do. I like to turn it around always, because the reason I'm saying this, there's another emotion right now that seem to be pervading us, the emotion of loss. We feel as if we lost, right? Those protests disappeared. Authoritarianism has been rising, and it seems like it's going to get worse. The idea of loss, the emotion of loss, has been also prevalent more contemporarily in our times. This is why I don't want emotions. It's not about what I want anyway, but focusing on only emotions and as if they are the triggers or they are the starters of certain political action or inaction seems a little unproductive for me. This is why currently I'm trying to reinterpret my work to tackle this emotion of loss, because what happened in Gezi Park, although it doesn't exist anymore, although the protests are not no more, and it's even worse in the political scene in Turkey, I think that moment or that experience uh, is trying to tell us something different. It needs to be interpreted differently, rather than what the emotion is kind of forcing us to interpret it in a way.
So I want you to explore, because we have the role of emotions, the construction of identities, the materialities of the collective action, but you had been referring a lot about the public space and the importance of reimagine the public space in different dimensions, like in the spatial dimension and the symbolic dimension from the action. So what are your thoughts regarding the use of a space and the physical presence that can contribute to the making of this new political community that you are referring in your book?
Yes, I think one of the things, actually, the book, I conceived the book, although it changed later, of course, as this urban insurgency. The space has always been at the center of it, and still, to a certain extent, remained at the core of the book too. But of course, this is all David Harvey, since David Harvey and maybe Manuel Castells too. We know that social movements and also the whole, if you like, capitalist accumulation and what it triggers in terms of social movements is taking place mostly in the city, in the urban areas, in the urban space. So urban space, and in my case, Istanbul, and also the Gezi Park, the Taksim area in Istanbul, has always been at the center of my analysis. Uh, but it's also difficult to understand urban space, trying to understand the role of space, urban space in shaping social movements, makes you feel, makes you understand, makes you come to the realization that you cannot speak of space as a monolith. We cannot easily just say public space in the city and just treat it as if it's just one monolithic space that things happen. Uh, it the way that I try to conceive, following other giants in front of me, was to see how the city as a space is fragmented, how there are different sites of urban sites where social movements, social activism can find different potentialities. It can be streets, of course, always. That kind of always begins, you march, or in front of factories where the point of production and workers are protesting. But then we learned in 2010s, it can be parks, it can be public spaces like actual physical places that can be occupied or reclaimed from the owners, even if it means the state or private owners. But then he learned that it can be also in the neighborhoods, smaller parks where residents of a neighborhood can gather together. It can be those rundown buildings that can be also squatted and claimed. So different sites, it came to my attention more and more as I was doing this research. Different sites offer different potentials for politics, different types of politics. Each create a set of actions, but also change the activists in the meantime. It gives the identity, if you like, or it makes the emotions, as we were talking, emerge in these different urban spaces. So the book tells the story of how these urban sites were interacting, or how these activists, what I called fluid politics, have been part of different parts, different sites in the urban area in Istanbul, and how they were assuming different identities, different political statuses, different activist roles, and eventually different identities. That created some sort of a synergy. That kind of created some sort of a unity at some point, at one point, that amplified the force of the protests. But again, it was paradoxical, the book argues towards the end, that what kind of made this movement bigger than it was, just the defense of a park, actually created those internal paradoxes as well, which kind of made it lose its potential and eventually dissipate. So
Okay,
space
Can.
is really, really important. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you another question, and after that, I'm going to open the floor to any of our, I don't know, attendees if they want to ask you something, and we can keep going with the conversation. But I think it would be good to start a conversation. But it's about the long-term impacts of Gezi Park. So you have described really interestingly how all this movement has reconfigured identities, collective actions, emotions. But what do you think is the long-term impact of this movement after all these years? And how do you think that affect or not this notion of political community that you have expressed in your book?
Yes. The long-term impact, actually, we are not that far away, to be honest, although it has been like 12 years, if you kind of count the moment of eruption at the park of these protests. But also, as I try to explain in the book, that we need to have a longer view. And I could do it only for about 2 or 3 years in the actual research because of its main focus, the forums, and I can try to explain it later if there are any questions about them. So what I'm saying, that the long-term effects is still yet to be seen, I guess. But I think of course, looking back from like 12 years later, what we see immediately, what hits our eyes, is that the movement is there no more. So there is no Gezi Park protest or anything like that. The activists are a little older right now. Those who are in their late 20s are now almost their 40s. If they were older, they are in their 50s and 60s. But I think it was a moment. It was a moment of hope. Coming back to the emotions because of what happened, not necessarily because of what it can do later, but how people experienced being in the park, being with others, joining with other identities. I think it made it seen what is possible, what can be done, even if you are not planning it. So, as I was saying, these radical practices that took place in the parks, in the communities, in the buildings, everywhere else too, in the urban space, they were not planned. That they just happened because they responded to a need, that immediate need in the politics that they were engaging. So it was about the neighborhood that they needed to be acted on, or it was the national politics. Something was needed. People were there, utilizing the resources in the urban space. If it was park, if it was street, protesting or clashing with the police, making a declaration, retweeting something, whatever it was, brought people together in a way that they prefigured. They lived a future that wasn't there. I think Gezi made it possible, or Gezi made it possible for people to imagine something like this, maybe again, maybe in the future again. So I think that's one of the important things about Gezi. The remainder is that it can happen again. That's the idea. And I know you like me when I say this, but I think Gezi was a rehearsal. Yes, you like this term, don't you? The rehearsal of something that we don't know yet. So it's like we are rehearsing something, we are trying something, and Gezi was one of those trials. And as far as I can keep, I kept contact with some of those activists, of course. There has always been this. When Gezi came again, so it will come back, people believe. At least, when I was in touch with them a couple of years ago, everybody hopes, everybody knows almost that this is going to happen again, one way or other. It just waits another trigger. It is hard to see this now in the middle of all the authoritarianism and all the terrible things that are happening everywhere. But I think what will remain with Gezi, that it was possible once, and it will come back again. That's something that people held on to so much, as I could observe. This is why I think a longer term view, the idea of episode was exactly that to begin with. We cannot, as students of social movements, I don't think it is fruitful, I don't think it's productive to focus on the beginning and an end of a protest as it happens. But I think it is important to continue to see how people are continually changing, how different maneuvers are being taken, how they continue to change in their identification of themselves, of the world. I think Gezi did this. Gezi taught this to the activists, and I think it should teach us, the scholars, the students of social movements too, that it's a continuing rehearsal.
Okay, thank you, Ken. So now we have 20 minutes, 25 minutes if you want, for conversation, questions, comments, and the floor is yours. So I don't know if Sergio, Carla, Dominica, Lydia want to. Yes, please, Sergio, welcome.
Hey,
Lydia.
Yes, many thanks for the presentation, Khan, and also for the very nice questions that Camilo made for you. So my question is about, we have this time of hope of these movements that very well described, and now we were living a time that also, as you told, the time of emotions, and also most of the groups on social media platforms, they are connected with the escalation of the far right. But also your research shows that mobilization can be also organized sometimes in the backstage or in a hidden movement that are not so visible, like the movement of the far rights, but they keep doing resistance. So what are the lessons learned of your research that we can face these activism nowadays that's very connected with agenda of the far right? How can we have like a new approach or a new wave of digital activism and social movements nowadays? That would be my question.
Thank you, Sergio, for that question. I think that's the question, isn't it, in our times, especially for students of social movements who are more on the progressive side, if you like, or the left, if I dare say, but also activists themselves to ask, what are we going to do? How are we going to understand, and what are we going to do against the far right movements? I always tend to try to understand the far right as a counter-revolution. They are like a response to something that they see happening. That is, this idea of people coming together in Gezi Park or Zuccotti Park or, different squares, Tahrir Square and whatnot. It kind of creates some sort of a fear, especially among the power holders, the state especially, but also their supporters. One thing maybe that can be understood, that our task is, of course, to fight against this. But our task is also try to understand the vulnerabilities of our movements, or vulnerabilities of the movements, more progressive movements that we are studying. This is kind of what I try to do. I don't know how successful in the book. When I try to delineate all these three dimensions happening at the same time, mobilization, always being on the street, always being actively involved, not necessarily just doing representative politics. This is great. Being on the streets, but using the space, being in the street, in the park, in the squat house, and changing your identity. Okay, I am going to fight the police here. I'm going to be a cook in the park. I'm going to retweet this. So different identities making us fluid, making activists fluid. What are the strengths? But also radical thinking. How are we going to change the world? How are we going to take care of this business in a way that has never been thought before? Those, I argue in the book, in the Gezi case, if you like, strengthened. It was like a synergy. It made the movement bigger than what it was. But also, it undercut, it undermined some of the things. For instance, being always in the street is too tiresome. People get tired. It's impossible to keep up that pace. Being in different places. If you want to be in this forum, which is in this neighborhood, wants to tackle the questions, but also if you are in a political party in the making, like the leftist party, that wants to change the country and change the world, like a big politics and local politics, they sometimes clash, almost always clash. Because we want to change the neighborhood, we want to change the world. Different mindsets in the same person might be sometimes difficult. Different places produce different politics. And this, kind of always trying to do something that hasn't been done before, that is, radical politics, there is always this tendency to become also a part of the existing politics, institutional politics. You want to become a party, a political party, to reach out to bigger groups of people. So there is this tension of being radical, but also institutional too. So I identified several things, several dynamics, if you like, contradictory, paradoxical. So our task then, Sergio, to answer your question more directly, if we want to face the decline, quote unquote, of our movements and the rise of the other movements, far right and whatnot, I think we have to understand, we have to work on the paradoxes of the movements and the vulnerabilities that those paradoxes lead to. I think that may be my answer.
Thank you, Ken. So I'm going to give the floor to Lydia, and after that to Dominika and to Brahim. So Lydia, if you want to go first.
Thank you very much for the floor. I'm sorry, I cannot appear, I cannot use my camera. I have some problem with my online connection. Just a few comments. I was thinking about how much the extent to which Alberto Melucci, the Italian sociologist, I think one of the most influential theorists and scholars in sociology of movements, actually he anticipated different aspects. I mean, the importance of the latency, the dimension of latencies when movements actually are not mobilizing, but still they are building their own collective identity. And this is it is an essential part of the also of the construction of their action. So identity and action are strictly connected. And also he underlined the dimension of the emotional dimension and how much the extent to which young social movements actually are like prophets of the present, since they anticipate in some way the future because of the prefigurative character of their action, which is actually aimed to respond to everyday life needs. And it is at the same time kind of utopian thinking, but rooted in everyday life with the aim of responding to needs, to basic needs. And I think this is also a legacy of the impact of neoliberalism in the last 2 decades, because you have to respond to problems and to actually to also implement a sort of, caring with it. In my interviews, I actually so many times collected these from young activists. They have an idea of an alternative to the present current, society that is as a kind of society of care, which is not something intended only on an individual ground, but something really collective, with an idea of implement kind of mutualistic action as a kind of model of political action. I'm sorry, maybe I took too much time. It was just commented.
Jan, would you like to do any comment?
Lydia, thank you so much for these comments. Actually, you very nicely summarized, maybe better than I did, what I tried to do in the book, especially with the latter part, the prefigurative part that you mentioned, how the utopias are actually rooted in everyday life actions. This is exactly why I ended up having the need to expand not just the temporal, if you like, the dimension to understand Gezi Park protests. They were not protests anymore that I was looking at. It was the protests plus the occupation plus the neighborhood forums plus the squat houses, which kind of took a couple of years, and then even trying to create a national political party, which eventually failed because they were beginning to use the language of not the utopia, but almost national politics that people are already tired of. People came to the park because they were tired of national politics, and talking about national politics actually closed the circle, if you like, of that moment, the large moment, the episode. That motivated people to begin with. I think that was very, very important. The initial part of the question, how Melucci is a part of course, I am building on Melucci as well as other people in the social movements literature. But I think what was novel in the 2010s were first social movements were more global. So resource mobilization or the visions or everything were not confined to national borders, but they were global and they were interacting. They were in connection with each other, learning from each other. Kind of even people going and visiting each other, but also electronically, over social media, interacting with each other. Even when social movements are seemingly dormant, there is not the active kind of mobilization happening. Those kind of resource work, I think you mentioned, and identity work was taking place in a global setting and in a longer period of time. I hope if there is any contribution that this book does to the giants of social movements, the literature, it is that it brings that global dimension and connection, if you like, but also maybe a longer view of how all these things unfolded. But thank you so much for your comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Lydia. Thank you, Kant, for the answer. So, Dominika, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Kant, so much for your brilliant presentations. Really so interesting. So, two-part question. The first one is about that particular moment in time, and you did mention that, you know, Gezi, like when Gezi happened, we had all this Occupy movements, and Arab Spring followed. So I wonder to what extent Gezi Park protests represent part of the sort of historical, emotional moment of that time, and to what extent it's particular, specific to the Turkish context, and you know, what is the dynamics in play. So then like the first part is to compare the broader perspective of that time, and the second part of the question is to follow up on what Brahim's just said. You know, like when I'm doing research now with pro-Palestinian protests, they do speak often about the liberation zones. So places in the encampments where they can govern and be in a different way, where, you know, this sense of utopia, caring for each other, taking decisions differently is a big part of that. So I wonder, you know, like I've been thinking to what extent you think that, you know, like these movements are repeating and using the same tools, and to what extent we can think of this as a cumulative process when, you know, we are learning from each other and over certain period of time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dominika. That's really helpful in terms of understanding what it is. And you are absolutely right. Gezi Park protests, of course, each protest, if you like, or each movement, of course, it has their own unique characteristics. There is a trigger that is definitely not the same in different contexts. It can be, again, a rise in the bus ticket prices, or it can be something like that. A president says or does, or an austerity measure in one country, or everything has its own unique, if you like, trigger in terms of different moments, but also in terms of its progress, if its trajectory, they have their uniqueness as well. By which I mean, for instance, in one setting, there may be a strong history, legacy of social movements that may, for instance, I was always interested in comparing Greece and Turkey, for instance, where left has historically been so strong compared to what has been in Turkey, and all the assemblies and all the protests, the way that people were mobilized, but also created these different visions, have always been stronger in the Greek context compared to the Turkish context, where the state has always been strong and dominant, historically speaking, too, and left has been always, even sometimes, compliant with what the state allows it to be, rather than being too radical, if you like. So there are all these differences. You're right, that's something specific. But I thought, as I was doing this research, and you rightly mentioned, that they reflected something about the moment, or the episode, if you like, of the 2010s, of that moment. And once again, I tried to capture this commonality, if you like, with these three dimensions that I was talking about. That is, it was almost everywhere that the people on the streets or in the forums were actively out there. It was some sort of a different type of politics where the activists, I remember one of my informants, one of the people that I interviewed for this project, told me that she was no longer a calendar activist. She didn't necessarily, for instance, May the 1st or some other important days, that she would sit at home until then and then maybe take a banner or a flag, be there for a couple of hours and then go back. She was the activism herself. So she identified herself with the movement. She was the movement. She was that thing, whatever that was emerging. And I think we could trace this in different movements around the world, especially particularly at that time. That was one thing that I figured I saw what's happening. The other was this use of space. Of course, the squares, the streets, but also the neighborhoods, squat houses, they were learning from each other. They were even imitating each other in the way that they made use of space. Space was really important. And finally, of course, all these radical acts, these prefigurative acts, which bring me to your second part of the question or comment. You were talking about liberation zones by the Palestinian activists. that radicalism, that trying something that hasn't been tried before, or maybe tried before something, maybe the remnants of it are remembered, carried over, but because of the new needs or the new conditions, like in the case of Palestine, obviously, an ongoing genocide and trying to survive as a people is important there too. So I reinterpreted those previous experiences, the utopia and the way of how you care yourself and others, care for others. It was another common thing, I think, and maybe continues to be even today about these movements. So specificities and commonalities, I think, will continue. Maybe commonalities will increase more because of the connections of these movements, because of course, everything about social media and internet and everything. The commonalities might become something more, especially as a result of the rise of authoritarianism and populism and everything else in the world too. So I totally agree with you about maybe some of the repetitions, if you like, or coming again of some of these acts. Thank you.
Thank you, Can. And finally, Brahim, do you want to ask Can?
Thank you, Professor Gomez. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to join the group. This is my first activity with you. Thank you, Professor Agartan, for this rich presentation. I would like to ask you about the role of football fans in the Gizi movement. I ask this question because I'm interested in the fan activism, football fan activism in Morocco. Second question, can we consider the Gizi movement a network social movement in the sense that Castles gives to the concept, considering that a large part of the activity of this movement was in social media? And thank you again.
Brahim, thank you so much. I was wondering if you could repeat the second question again. What were you asking about the role? Was it the role of social media in particular or something else?
Yes. I ask you about the role of social media.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brahim. Thank you so much for your questions. Football fans, yes, this was something very popular, very relevant in the case of Gezi Park protests. Now, Istanbul, as you may know, Brahim, yourself, since you're interested in football, has three big soccer clubs. Huh? And they have been for more than 100 years. They have been really in contention with each other. They had sometimes ugly pasts, if you like, in terms of how fans treated each other and whatnot. But Gezi Park is also remembered for bringing these different fans together for a common cause, for a common fight. So it was at that very rare moments, if not like a single moment in history of these clubs, that the fans, especially some of them, obviously not all of them, could come together in protesting the government for its plans for the Gezi Park. You could see many flags of these three major Istanbul clubs in the park when it was occupied after a couple of days of clashes with the police too. And some groups within these fans of these particular clubs have been really active mobilizing those fans against the government's plans to defend the park, and later took really important role, if you like, when it came for the forums. When the park was dispersed and the forums began to meet in different, firstly, two big other Istanbul parks, those local parks, were the places where those fans, football fans, gathered before, for instance, before the beginning of a soccer match. So they were close to those stadiums, if you like, where soccer fans would meet, get together, feel this euphoria before the game, and then they would go. So these two other parks, after the main park was dispersed, became the house of the bigger forums that later divided into, smaller forms. So you are absolutely right about how fans could become really instrumental in mobilizing the movement against the government or whatever they want to do. The social media is, of course, in the 2010s, as you know, the hype. It was very, very important. People could connect, through social media, through electronic communication means and whatever. So it was almost like too much exaggerated, Brian, if you like, the role of social media. It was as if the revolution was happening online. We all want, it was like that there was this push, if you like, that we should believe that the revolution is being not broadcasted, but tweeted or, on the Facebook. But later research shows, and mine too, hopefully, is that it's not enough. Social media can only be one of the channels, if you like, of maybe connecting with people. Of course, it has its problems, but I think movements, if you like, revolutions or other types of protests need a physical space, need actual people gathering, like the bodily experience is really, really important. Being tired, or having different emotions and sharing them with those people around you is not just a tweet, is not just cannot be just on the social media. That's what we realize. And the hype for social media, I sometimes think cynically that it was purposeful, right? Maybe preventing people from really actively physically getting together and maybe making us believe that, just retweeting is enough. Just hashtag will solve our problems and bring the revolution. A cynical thinking might say that this was purposefully, pumped and exaggerated to keep people away from each other, to keep people reclaim the space. And Gezi Park protests and many protests of the 2010s were actually because people actually experienced in their body, in their physical body, the consequences of neoliberalism. Being houseless, kind of unhoused, or being even hungry, or, losing your neighborhood. You see that new high rises are just demolishing your park. So you actually experience the air pollution, the traffic pollution. So it is not something that you can just wish away with a hashtag. It doesn't solve that. You have to actually get out and protect the park and meet with other people who want to be out there to protect the park. So yes, social media is important to circulate the messages and everything. But at the end of the day, I think it is when it becomes really physical in the space, in the actual physical space, where bodies get together, where emotions are changed, and when a future is experienced in the present, is prefiguratively experienced in the present without a plan to begin with. What are we doing now? And that happens. But you have to be there together in the physical space. That's what I learned from my own research. And thank you so much for the question, Brian. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Can. Do we have a final question? Anybody else who wants to ask anything else to Can? Right. So, Can, thank you so much for coming to share, of course, all these interesting ideas based on your book. And thank you so much for you to come this afternoon, this morning, this night, I don't know, depending of your time zone. And where we can find the book? I know that it's edited by Edinburgh University Press, but can you buy the book on Amazon, right? I guess so.
I think yes. Well, all the major online bookstores are, I think, selling it. I hope it is available in more brick and mortar bookstores too. It's a little expensive, and I apologize for that. Hopefully, a paperback edition is going to come maybe later this year. But yes, it should be available on the publisher's website as well as other major bookstores.
Perfect, Can. So,
thank you.
Do we have another session in 2 weeks that we're going to present a book regarding Latin American social movements. So please be, of course, I don't know, we're going to send an email, but please be aware that this is coming. And as I say to Dominika, if you want to use this space for you to present any particular research, or if you want to do a conversation or whatever, this space of RC48 is for us. So please contact me or contact Can, and we will be more than happy to organize something for you. So thank you once again for being here, and see you in Rabat, hopefully physically, and hopefully see you in 3 weeks again in this space. And have a good afternoon, night, or morning.
I want to also thank you, Camilo, for the questions, and everyone else who are here at the meeting, but also who are listening at YouTube. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys. Have a good one.